No one is swallowing the Nutters Iran baloney, and the X factor in productivity, coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 28th of August 2025. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be discussing the somewhat sudden event this week where ASIO blamed Iran for some of the anti-Semitic arson attacks that have occurred. So we'll tell you in Paul Keating's words why that's rubbish.
And why ASIO are nutters.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll discuss in the terms of productivity, some of what came out of and what didn't come out of Jim Chalmers' Economic Roundtable's discussions last week. Now, before we start, please do help share the show by hitting the like button, making a comment below, sharing on social media. You can also join us as a member. You'll see the links in the box below, and you can donate to help the cause and the mission to transform Australia, which is urgent. And before we get into the first topic proper, we have some updates. Since last Thursday, which I think you announced on the show, we had a national day of action to get people weighing in to help the Queenstown, west coast of Tassie town save their last bank, which is a Bendigo Bank branch. And since that happened, there's been quite a few developments.
Well, we put out a release, Elisa, saying Albanese must save Queenstown's last bank from the pinstripe mafia. And the reason we're saying that is because the current CEO of Bendigo Bank, Richard Fennell, he wasn't there when Bendigo Bank made a name for itself as the community bank. And the way that happened was in the 90s, we had the first wave of bank branch closures for one reason. Because we had a public bank, the Commonwealth Bank, we had a government bank. When it was there, it had the biggest branch network in Australia, and it set the standard for providing a service, and all the private banks had to compete with it, and so they maintained a branch network as well. And the people who called for the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank actually predicted that when they privatised it, there would be a wave of branch closures, and there was. Because suddenly, all these banks could say, oh no, service is less important. So there's a big wave of branch closures. And at the time, Bendigo Bank, because it wasn't one of the big four, saw that, hang on, there is an opportunity here. So it was a commercial opportunity for them, but you can make money providing a service. And they set up their community bank model. So if they weren't setting up their own bank branches in these towns, they moved into these towns. If they weren't setting them up, they would set up community banks where the locals raised the money, invested in the building, etc. Got a lot, some agreement with Bendigo Bank. They provided they covered all the running costs of the branch, and Bendigo Bank did the backroom processing stuff. It was a very successful model, and it established Bendigo Bank's reputation. Well, Mr. Fennell came along in around 2009. Now, he's bided his time moving up the ranks in Bendigo Bank. But where did he come from? This is what's relevant. He comes from PwC and also IBM. And the IBM part would be a background that's given him, like most bankers, an obsession with digital banking, right? But the PwC thing is the more relevant. Friend of the show, Lord Prem Sikka of Kingswood and Basildon in the House of Lords in the UK, who we knew before he was made a Lord. Prem Sikka has done a lot of work on exposing the big four accountancy firms. These are the big four global firms that think they run the world, and governments ever let them run the world. They're the auditors to all the big global corporations, and they're consultants to everybody, right? And their mentality is just, how do you extract as much money out of everything that moves, right? That's how these consultants think. So Mr. Fennell, now that from 2018, he became the head of retail banking at Bendigo Bank, and now he's the CEO. But from that time he was the head of retail banking, he's the one who said, we're not going to be the community bank anymore. And the breaking news, Elisa, that journalist Dale Webster has actually confirmed by going through the figures, since 2020, under his leadership of the retail bank, Bendigo Bank has left more towns with no other bank than all the big four banks combined. They've shut most of the 100 branches that Bendigo Bank has shut since 2020 are the last bank in town. And they've shut the last bank in town more than the big four banks combined. And they've got away with it because they did it under the shadow of the big four banks. This latest round is while the big four banks have a moratorium. So that's the nature of this guy. He's from the pinstripe mafia. And were they unprofitable before? No, they're not unprofitable. They make about 7% return on equity. That's pretty standard for banks worldwide, except the big four banks in Australia are the most profitable banks in the world. And he was in the press this week saying, we want to be at that level of profit. So stuff you, Queenstown, the whole west coast of Tasmania. Stuff you, 22 towns in Australia that he's ripping out the last genuine banking service. And there's 16 towns on top of that he's ripping out the Bendigo Bank branch or agency. Stuff you, I have decided with my background in the pinstripe mafia, man, we're joining the big boys. And you can see that on their ads.
Yeah, and it was just reported to us today that this will run this ad that they're still currently running on TV. This was seen on Channel 7.
But look for the woman in the middle of the ad, 30-second ad. Look in the middle, the woman wearing the woman who looks like she's from the country. Look at that bit.
You know what's better than a big four bank?
A bank that's bigger for me. Bigger for making my money work harder.
And helping my business make it.
Bigger for helping us to buy a home.
Bigger for the community I care about.
My bank is bigger for what matters most. As Australia's most trusted bank, 2.5 million Aussies know that Bendigo Bank is bigger for them. And we're bigger for you.
Bendigo Bank, the better big bank.
So what you see, Elisa, is shameless misrepresentation. So they've got a rural person there, someone to look like an actress to look like a rural person, and got the dog and the Hilux or whatever. And what's she saying? Bendigo Bank supports our community, the communities we love. Really?
Yeah.
Really, Bendigo Bank? You are ripping the guts out of them because of the pinstripe mafia that's in charge.
Now, two other things. ABC did some good local coverage down there, which they had a TV. We'll show the video clip of the TV footage that the segment that they ran, but that was also accompanied by an article in the ABC media.
Look, and this we are generating press coverage of this because like it is a shocking situation. So that they've covered it locally, and that follows 7:30 report last week covering the broader closures using the case of Yarram.
Victoria, yeah.
But just have a look at some of this ABC coverage here.
Businesses and residents on Tasmania's west coast will soon have to travel more than 150 kilometres to find the nearest bank branch. Bendigo Bank is shutting its Queenstown branch next month, and many in the community are concerned about the impact.
For many in this community, cash is king. But in a month's time, the last bank in town is closing its doors.
The Bendigo Bank is supposed to be the community bank, so funnily enough, we would have expected them to take a little bit more notice about us before they made that unilateral decision.
Ian Robertson runs the West Coast Wilderness Railway. With cafes in Queenstown and in Strawn, as well as the train service, he's worried about what the closure will mean for the business.
And had they engaged with us, then they would have found out that we did have some very real concerns and how it will impact us. And there's a cost implication to the business as well.
When the branch closes, the post office across the road will fill the void.
The Bendigo goes, we've got a 2.5 hour run to any bank with limited services at the post office and things like that. But that's a post office for letters and parcels, not a bank.
It's not just businesses who are worried about the bank's closure.
We're devastated about it.
I'm 73 and I don't do internet banking and stuff like that.
You just can't pop in and get some advice or, talk to someone over the counter. Very disappointing.
Local, state and federal representatives have jointly called on Bendigo Bank to stand by the community here in Queenstown and keep the branch open. Bendigo Bank says it didn't make the decision lightly, but fewer customers are using branches to do their banking.
A reduction in business activity and an increase in costs to Bendigo have also played a part. Since the announcement though, many in the community have been trying hard to convince the bank to stay.
Anything's possible until it's not. We're hoping that we may be able to entice the Bendigo Bank to change their views.
Despite the community opposition, the bank is on track to permanently close on the 26th of September. Mac Hurd, ABC News, Queenstown.
And then the other factor was...
Well, hang on, before you go on, I just want to mention, I had a breakfast in that cafe at the historical railway. It's a brilliant business, right? And when I was in Queenstown a few weeks ago, I stayed in a motel. This was an enormous motel. It's a small town. Queenstown is it's a big town on the west coast of Tasmania, but it's a small town by mainland standards. It had a massive, there probably had 100 rooms in this motel, because that's what happens in tourist season. The population just expands out of sight. They need to do commerce. The businesses need to get cash and change, etc. Right? It's all been taken away from them. And that cafe, the railway cafe there, was brilliant.
Now the closure was also raised in Parliament this week.
Well, this is, and hopefully it's raised again. So we've been, last Thursday, Elisa, we had this day of action that you talked about, and we bombarded Jim Chalmers and Albanese with phone calls, and the people in Queenstown made the calls. The local Queenstown press and radio station, etc., they were so fired up. They were covering this. The local state member of Parliament, Gavin Pearce, was really fired up, and he was promoting it on radio, etc. The whole town got behind this. Yeah, let's have a day of action, and they all called Albanese and Chalmers, and then we'd put out the statement around Australia, and we had lots of other calls going in. So they would have got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls that day, just bombarding them that we need you to save the last bank on Tasmania's west coast. And my argument is, if the banks are ever unhappy with government policy, and I was on Martin North's show this week, and I used the example. In fact, we'll put it up. There's a clip here that I want people to see from I was looking for this example, and let's just put up the Google search on the screen. And what you see there is 2022. Sydney Morning Herald, and the two headlines are one day apart. And the first headline shows that the government adopted the policy of $1 million fines for bankers who have committed misconduct. Fine the bankers, not just the company. Fine the executives. They're the ones responsible, because if you fine the company, you fine the shareholders. They haven't done anything, right? And the very next day, they dropped it. And why? Because the banks called Jim Chalmers. Anna Bligh, the head of the Banking Association, called Jim Chalmers and said, no, you will not do this. And it worked. Jim Chalmers dropped it. So when the banks want to get their own way, they call the government. And what I'm saying is, who's in charge here? We need to save this bank in Queenstown. Now, we'd save it by setting up a postal bank, but we're not in government. We're trying to get them to do that. That's going to take a while. This bank is closing on the 26th of September, this next month, right? So Jim Chalmers, it's time for you, or Albanese, it's time for you to call this guy Richard Fennell and say, Fennell, guess what? We're the government of Australia. You're not closing that bank. You think you're a private business. Well, you can be a private business, but we have all this leverage. Hey, we are the government after all, right? There will be consequences. It's not costing you money. It's making a profit. You're keeping the bank open because you are not allowed. And this is a message to all. Use Bendigo Bank. Make an example of for all the banks. No bank is going to be allowed anymore to shut the last bank in town. How dare you? It devastates country towns, absolutely smashes them. How dare you? You're not going to do it. That's what we need the government to muscle up and do.
Yeah.
Oh, they're a private business. Screw you and your private business. The government should not do that to a milk bar. The government should not do that to the local pub. But these are big corporations. Who owns them? They're mostly owned overseas. Don't fall for this private business rubbish when it comes to corporations. You want the government to be absolutely cruel to corporations. Grind them under their heel.
Tax them to death.
Make them behave. Make them serve the people. Yep. They'll still make money. Never care about the human rights of corporations. They're not human, right? Care about small business. We'll talk about them in a minute, but not these corporations. The government must pull rank, and that's what we want them to do.
And that was the upshot of the regional banking inquiry in any case.
Absolutely.
The government hasn't responded to.
Absolutely. So, now, I can't help, I lose it when I talk about this, right? So we're going to contrast me to the local federal member of parliament. Let's play a clip from her. When I was at the Queenstown protest meeting a few weeks ago, the Labor federal member of parliament was there too, Anne Urquhart. And in the meeting, I'm going after the government, and she was trying desperately to deflect blame from the government. Because I was saying, this is happening because the government hasn't responded to the Senate inquiry. Now, Anne Urquhart is not an idiot. As a local member, she knows that she's got to be advocating for this bank. So we'll play a bit of the clip here of what she did in Parliament. She made a statement the last few days in Parliament, which is good. But when you listen to the statement, just understand, she's in the government. Why isn't she telling Albo what I just carried on about? She needs to represent the town that's going to be smashed by this closure. None of this mild-mannered stuff. Sorry, Anne. But anyway, because the words, she knows the problem. Play the clip.
Bendigo Bank has just made a decision to close the only bank on the west coast of Tasmania in Queenstown. That is a fast-growing region. There's hopefully in the next couple of years a new mine will reopen. It's a powerhouse of Tasmania. Bendigo operates the only bank on the west coast. There is no other banks, and the closest one is about a 5-hour round trip away up in Burnie. So for people who live on the west coast, this is a very difficult time for them. I've met with Bendigo on 2 occasions and asked them to reconsider their position.
And that's my point. You know, it's not that they are the government. Before we go on, I've got to tell you this. So Bob Katter, everyone knows who Bob Katter is. Bob Katter is a great champion of a postal bank. He wants. I talk to Bob Katter when I'm in Parliament. I often go and see Bob Katter, and we've collaborated on a bunch of things. And we're certainly collaborators on bringing back a public bank. Bob's a massive fan of a public bank. Bob likes telling stories, and often you hear the stories more than once. And one of his is he was talking about a conversation he had with an old-time Labor Senator, Kim Carr, who's no longer in Parliament. And Kim Carr said to Bob, nobody wants to govern anymore. And Bob cites that story because it's true. And by govern, I mean do what I said. You take charge of a situation, say this is what's going to happen, right? Govern. You are the government. Now, when it comes to corporations, they're hands off. Oh, please. Oh, let's set some what do they call it? Let's set some policies to create market signals to incentivise them to do it. No, rubbish. Do it. Just do it.
Now, before we get to our first topic, which we're not at yet, did you want to make a note about?
Yeah, I do want to comment on this. Look, the main topic we're going to cover today is the ASIO announcement about Iran. But the other breaking news that day was this sovereign citizen murder of 2 policemen. And everyone remembers 2 years ago there was the killing in Queensland of the policeman near Chinchilla there. This one is a little bit different. But anyway, so look, a couple of things. We're the Citizens Party. We've been at this 37 years. We do a lot of research. I'm the research director. A lot of people say to me, "You're a think tank. You're not a political party." That's how much research we do, right? You've turned into a research machine. We've looked at all these questions, right? Sovereign citizen stuff is pseudo-legal rubbish. It's a fantasy. It's just mythology. It's garbage. It's an alternate universe, and it's not true. We once wrote an article. Australia is a corporate state, not a corporation. By corporate state, we mean the corporations are in charge. But look, the Mussolini model. But we're not a corporation. You know. Anyway, so you can come at me about that, whatever. But that's our view of it. But that's not why I'm making this statement. It's not to criticise that stuff as such. But when it gets to this point, there's more than one dynamic at play. It shouldn't get to this point. People can feel boxed in by what they believe in and feel like they're being targeted, and then you get this. Last week, on the Monday, Four Corners did a story on sovereign citizens, and the next day, you'll vouch, I commented on it in our office meeting, and I said, I felt it was unbalanced because they overly emphasised the potential for violence. They made that was their whole reason for doing that, and now you can say this has come true. Maybe they were prophetic. What I'm worried about is a story like that becomes a trigger for these kinds of people. But anyway, that's not my main criticism. My main criticism is they did not acknowledge that there's a more general reason why people are losing trust in government. And it wasn't just the pandemic, it happened before that. And we're going to give some of the reasons why when we talk about ASIO making stuff up. There's a history to that. There's a fundamental economic and governance reasons why Australians and people around the whole world, especially the Western world, are fundamentally losing trust in their governments. And the governments tend to be dominated by a couple of major parties who've been the establishment for decades and decades, and they don't want to look at it. And so they just keep ploughing ahead with their rubbish that's making the situation worse. I'll give you an example. Albanese's solution to the housing crisis, the 5% deposit. They're saying, oh, look how many of these young people are going to get in. Yeah, they're going to already get into debt traps because you are forcing up house prices even more. The problem is how expensive housing is. And everything you do makes it more expensive so you can say, oh, we've done something, right? And it's crushing young Australians, this housing crisis, absolutely crushing them. But you do not want to look at the solution because you don't want to look at the banks. The banks are the ones profiting. That's why our banks are the most profitable in the world. And you won't look at the vested interest. And Australians, if they don't know it in the detail we do, they smell it. And there's absolutely no trust. And the real fundamental cause of this crisis is the lack of trust in government. And governments have earned that lack of trust. And we're not going to ever move beyond this and actually get society back where you can bring these people in from the fold unless government wins back trust. One thing it has to do is stop being corrupt. We've got to clean out corruption. There's a lot of it in Australia. That's why we expose the revolving door between politicians and then like the banks and the mining companies and the defence, the weapons manufacturers. All these ex-politicians, they're just feeding on the trough, getting their reward, right? But also, we've got to get government to adopt policies where they're serving the people again, starting with a public bank.
Yep.
That's when you'll get trust back in government. That's fundamental, and that's my view of this. The government has to look at their role in this problem.
Yep, and we're about to, right now in our first topic, unearth a bit of that corruption, at least one aspect of it.
Yep.
So that is, no one is swallowing the Nutters Iran baloney. And we're referring here to the quote to remind people from Paul Keating, former Prime Minister. In May 2019, he said this: when the security agencies are running foreign policy, the Nutters are in charge.
And that was such a beautiful quote at the time. And he was talking about ASIO and the claims ASIO was making at that time about China. But what was beautiful about it, Elisa, we know a lot about the history of the intelligence agencies because we've researched it, not just looked at Facebook posts.
Yeah.
We know they're nutters. We know they can't be trusted.
Yes.
We know they were set up to undermine democracy. And nowadays, there's no politician in Parliament that you think even questions them. So to have an old timer like Paul Keating express that, it's like, at least people used to, right?
And it's not even just the local nutters. That's what really makes it important, because you're talking about the Five Eyes intelligence agencies being the umbrella group for our local agencies like ASIO.
Yep.
And what Five Eyes means is that they're intelligence agencies working together, not elected officials from those 5 countries. The intelligence heads, they conspire and coordinate and work together. And one of the key guys in Australia that pushes this, what he calls transnational model of security, is the disgraced former department head of Home Affairs and various other departments in his time, Michael Pezzullo, who was sacked for multiple breaches of the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct, but has been revived by the media for a role in promoting, and we talked about this a couple of
this is a guy who's lucky
ago.
he's not in prison, yet he's the number one security commentator in the media now.
And so there's been a drumbeat from him from beginning of the year where he's called for this multi-agency campaign to combat the so-called anti-Semitism. He called for an Operation Sovereign Borders type offensive where the government would declare a national terror situation. The Home Affairs Ministry would be strengthened to be given maximum power to act as an agency, powerful enough, as he described it, to fight a war. And so it was this guy who on the 7th of July, after the Israeli-US strikes on Iran had occurred, called on the government to create an ASIO-led task force to act in anticipation of a new terror attack. And this is what he told The Australian at that time, 7th July. He said, regrettably, we have to assume that such an attack is now probable, to use the ASIO rating, probable, especially as Iranian and possibly other hostile services might decide that mass casualty attacks on Jewish people and or places would be an effective way to strike back at Israel. So then after the message that, well, after two things, the message that Netanyahu sent to Albanese, denouncing him for daring to suggest we would support a Palestinian state.
And also demanding that he act against anti-Semitism by a certain deadline.
Exactly. And then secondly, the incredible marches, which we can put up some footage in the background, that happened all across Australia last Sunday. Suddenly this week we have the ASIO announcement that some of the anti-Semitic attacks that have occurred in recent months were done by Iran.
So essentially what ASIO has done is confirm Pizzolo's warning, but by retrofitting these older attacks, like the Adass Israel Synagogue attack was 2024. I forget when the Lewis Continental one in Sydney is probably around that time as well. So attacks from last year, and there were arson attacks. The Adass Israel Synagogue one was a serious fire. It burnt a significant part of the Adass Israel Synagogue. The Lewis Continental one was a pathetic attempt, right? But if you're a Jewish person involved in it, you feel targeted and afraid. So let's just, we take that side of it very, very seriously. But the police, ever since, have been looking at these attacks, and they couldn't find any evidence of any of them to connect them to actual anti-Semitism, i.e. politically motivated violence. What they found was these strange links to organised crime, where in the case of most of the ones in Sydney, it was a guy trying to create the impression of a wave of anti-Semitic violence so he could pretend to solve it for the cops and then use that as leverage to get a reduction on his sentence, right? So anyway, the cops have said that the cops couldn't find any actual evidence, and cops have to deal in evidence. Now, there's a chance. Okay, a couple of other things to say. Back to Adass Israel Synagogue. The Adass Israel Synagogue is strange because that particular sect of Judaism is not Zionist. There's quite a few Orthodox Jewish groups around the world who have not bought into Zionism whatsoever. They have no truck with the state of Israel. Right? They have a traditional Jewish view of their scriptures, etc., and they're all waiting for the Messiah to come. Right? They just haven't bought into the Zionist idea that the Messiah is going to come, when we establish the state of Israel. So there's nothing about them that makes them an enemy of the Iranians and would make them an Iranian target. Nothing about them at all. So that's just strange. And the Iranians know. The Iranians are very sophisticated. They know that this would be a Jewish group that's not pro-Zionist. So that part is quite bizarre, right? In the case of the Lewis Continental one, now I've been consulting people about this. There is a person who was arrested and is now out on bail, who was clearly involved in that particular incident. So his name is a Shiite Lebanese name. And he claims that he was paid $12,000 to do this attack, and he subcontracted it out to a couple of, I'm going to use as a term of endearment, bogan white Aussies with very white names, and it was Keystone cops, and the police had all the text messages between them, etc., where they're talking in real street language. I mean, these people are just criminals. That's all the Lebanese guy is just a criminal. However, as someone put it to me, because he's a Lebanese Shia, he's probably got relatives in Lebanon. Some of those relatives may be members of Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militia in Lebanon. Some of those may have trained in Iran, because Iran supports the Shiite militia in Lebanon. And that would be enough, the way intelligence works, to link the attack to Iran. Got it. And let's play a clip now, because if you want to see the way intelligence gets politicised, once I saw this said in the US Congress, I never forgot it, that Obama's CIA chief, John Brennan, was in the US Congress in 2017 testifying, and he said this about his job as an intelligence chief, what he does and what he doesn't do. Just listen.
I never was an FBI agent, I never was a prosecutor, so I really don't do evidence, I do intelligence.
So people should always remember that distinction, Elisa, between intelligence and evidence. What the cops have to trade in is evidence. Intelligence agencies don't. And the reason we went into the Iraq War and so many other things now, the Russiagate scandal in the United States, right? You see everywhere you turn examples of intelligence agencies cooking up intelligence for political purposes.
And so ASIO identified certain their partners internationally from where this intelligence came.
Well, they identified that it came from foreign partners.
Okay.
They didn't name them. And we've posed the question, who's that? Now, the obvious one is Five Eyes, because ASIO is primarily Five Eyes. Like, don't think of ASIO as, it's got the name Australian in it.
Yeah.
It was set up to be a branch of Five Eyes. MI5 demanded it. So it operates as Five Eyes. So the Five Eyes definitely wanted us to have this intelligence. By kicking out the ambassador from Iran, the press actually today reports the previous Australian government's position that the reason they hadn't done this earlier, they hadn't enlisted the IRGC as terrorists earlier, is because Australia is a back channel between the United States and Iran, has been for decades. And so Australia has always had a good relationship with Iran and approved by the United States, because that's the one way they could talk to the Iranians. So by taking this step, they would have only done it with the permission of the US government, right? So that's one obvious one. But the other one that people have to ask is, Israel, right? Is it Mossad? Is that the source of this? Now, the Jewish press, the Israeli press in Israel, they're full of speculation that it was. They want to take credit for this action in Australia, right? They're saying, it looks like we did this. We came up with the intelligence.
Wow.
Well, if that's the case, I mean, how stupid are we, right?
Yeah.
The Israeli government is desperate to get a general war going with Iran. And they will tell any lie to make that happen. And, they also are clearly reacting to what's happened politically in Australia, because thanks to the protests, just like, I'll give you an example, our friend John Lander, friend of the show, he started off as at DFAT in the late 60s. He was in DFAT in the early 70s when the anti-war protests against Vietnam got very large. And they got so large that he says, he and others in DFAT, responding to those anti-war protests, they were agitating inside the department for a change in policy. That's how it works. And we're seeing these massive protests now about Palestine. Albanese has shifted, finally, to a point of recognising Palestine. That is weakening our relationship with not just Israel, but with the United States, right? And so enter Five Eyes and the network to come up with this, to sort of put their fangs back in and say, no, you're going to toe the line here. And what Albanese does is he seems to be in some respects he's an incredibly weak politician, but when he goes and does something a little bit game, he always seems to balance it with something else on the other side, right? So with China, he'll go and have this great 1 week visit with Xi Jinping, and that's all good. And then he'll escalate the AUKUS arrangement with America to show, oh no, I'm really with you guys. And so he's pushed the envelope on recognising Palestine, etc.
Yep.
And now he did, without hesitation, he said it's not up to the government to question the intelligence agencies. Really? Ask Paul Keating, right? It is up to the government to question the intelligence agencies, but
look,
it's politically opportunistic.
Look, that's exactly what we have to be doing right now, is questioning it. We had a reminder in the lead of our Australian Alert Service about the Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction lies. We're really playing with fire, leading in this direction on Iran, because, as you said, Israel wants a war on Iran, but they don't want to do it alone. They want the Western countries in with them. That's what they're trying to generate and up here.
They can't do it alone. That's the thing.
So that's not a pathway the world wants to go on.
Yep.
All right, now Next topic, the X factor in productivity. Again, this is something that's documented in our Australian Alert Service, so you can subscribe to that. You can find the links below, and we'll put a copy of this article online. But the X factor is banking. And
absolutely. I bet it wasn't talked about once.
Well, I don't know if they had any bankers there. They didn't officially, but at the round table.
Well, maybe that's something at least.
Yeah.
Because it would have been Anna Bligh if it was a banker there.
Yeah, no. I mean, they talked about representatives of government, business, unions, academia, civil society, and a few other in betweens. But so Chalmers hosted this 3-day economic reform roundtable last week. And just ahead of that, just to situate, because the big focus was, of course, productivity, which is, in a very bad state of affairs. The Reserve Bank had just put out figures ahead of the meeting, revising its productivity forecast for the period ahead down from 1% to 0.7%. But for 2025, productivity is running at -1%. And the RBA described the trend, which has been in decline since 2000, as a broad-based and persistent trend, with the main contributing factors being lagging capital equipment, technology and skill levels, declining competition and regulatory barriers.
Can I comment on the first two? Lagging capital equipment. So, no business, or hardly any business, buys capital equipment out of current revenue.
Mm-hmm.
They borrow for it. Banks do not want to lend money to businesses.
Yep.
Not just that, Elisa, there's another factor. What capital equipment doesn't use electricity?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that energy costs is not on that list is bizarre. We have crushing energy costs. Energy costs in Australia went up 13% in the last 12 months, on top of already crushing levels of energy costs.
Mm-hmm.
And, hello?
Yes.
What are you going to do about that?
And that's why in our report we state, because we make the case for a return to public credit, because the things that banks won't necessarily lend to on particularly large-scale infrastructure, things that are going to make the costs of utilities cheaper, that is something that government often has to do, because it's not going to necessarily be immediately profitable, although in the long run it is, particularly in the way that it transforms the operating costs, as you said, of every business within the framework that infrastructure intersects.
Yep.
But the other thing that backed up what the RBA said about those factors that I just mentioned in terms of productivity was another report that they put out, which has just been released last month, or this month, and that's on competition. And in that report on competition in Australia's economy, they stated that our industries have become more concentrated, their leaders more entrenched.
That is the big companies.
And price markups higher. And they said that low competition basically blunts the drive for business to invest, innovate and adopt new technologies.
Yep.
And they said in that report that if we still had the level of productivity that we had in the mid-2000s, that would have represented a 1 to 3% higher rate. Sorry, if we still had the level of competition of the mid-2000s, that would have represented a 1 to 3% higher level of productivity, providing up to an additional $3,000 per person in the economy.
And Elisa, this is something the Citizens Party has followed since the 90s, because they introduced competition policy in the 90s, and it was supposed to make us more competitive, and all they did, and it was drafted by someone from Macquarie Bank, so we shouldn't be surprised, Fred Hilmer, what they have achieved in the 30 years since they've implemented competition policy is an economy with fewer competitors. And essentially what they did is they actually took away by going after, they went after the small players. So they went after things like the dairy industry, which had regulations and protections, because the dairy industry is a big industry, but it's made up of small businesses, farmers, right? And they were in co-ops and all sorts of stuff, and they had these regulatory protections. They took that away and put them at the mercy of the big supermarkets and the big processors. right? And often the processes were multinational, and they just picked them apart, undercut the price, etc. That was just one example. There was lots of other examples where they did that. And what they did is by taking away the protections for the small guys, they empowered the big guys. And then naturally what happens in a market as well, the really big guys swallow the slightly smaller guys, and they get even bigger. And so 30 years later, we have ended up with an economy where every single sector you look at is highly concentrated in just a handful of corporations, starting with banks, airlines, supermarkets, consultancy firms. Everywhere you look, highly concentrated, uncompetitive economy. Insurance. There's only 3 insurance companies in Australia. There's hundreds of insurance brands, but 3 companies. And that's why it's really good news the Tasmanian state government is going to bring back a public insurance company. And we need to do that with every sector. If we need we should turn Rex into a public airline, right? We've given Qantas so much money, just renationalise the damn thing. Make it serve the people of Australia again. Public bank, right? That's the big one, right?
Yes,
break the power of the
yes.
banks. That's how you do it.
Yes. Now, talking about public banking, so Jim Chalmers did spend quite a bit of time. He introduced every morning the roundtable discussions, and one of his big factors that he talked about was attracting more investment. Now, apparently there's not enough, even while all our super's fleeing overseas, and deepening.
Good point. We've got more than $3 trillion in a superannuation pool forced in there by the government, and we can't attract investment.
No. And the need for deepening capital flows in our economy, similar thing. And this is what he actually said. He said, if there was one switch that we could all flick to instantly make our economy much more productive, somebody would have flipped that switch already.
Bam.
And, you know, to me, I mean, that really rubbed the wrong way, because I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with a public banking expert, Alan Brown, and we spoke about how the state of North Dakota in America literally did that in a bank that was created in 1918 by farmers, because they said, we just don't have the credit we need.
Yep.
And we got banks, you know, with their knee on our neck.
Yep.
When we do make a profit, we can't reinvest, and they started a bank, and the bank creates the credit to lend to other banks and to unleash throughout the economy. That is like that magic switch.
It's the magic switch.
That just unleashes the credit to allow the things that you know, the RBA was saying we're lacking, like lagging capital equipment, technology and skill levels, all those things that just takes, you know, the addition of some credit to put in there to begin.
Well, let's look at this graph, because let's look at what the problem is in Australia in one graph. This is shout out to the originator of this graph, Dr. Wilson Tsai. This is just APRA data, and you'll never get a better example of the problem in Australia, right? We used to have banks that lent 70% to business, 30% to housing, and now it's completely flipped. Now, the red line is the most important, because if you're not lending to business, that's where, like, businesses are the ones that produce, right? If you're not lending to businesses, you are undercutting productivity in Australia. Elisa, in 2017, the Small Business Ombudsman, Kate Carnell, a Liberal, remember this, we were really surprised the Liberal said it, she called for a government bank to lend to small business. There were so much at the end of their tether. Now, remember that year, she called for that. Bill Shorten called for a manufacturing bank. Even Morrison jumped on the bandwagon and called for some kind of affordable housing bank. So we put out a statement saying, one bank to solve it all, right? Just start a national bank again like the Commonwealth Bank, and it can do all of those things. Because what would a public bank do? You've given an example of North Dakota. What would it do here?
Yep.
Well, first of all, because it's a public bank, you say, okay, we want to boost small business, we want to boost productivity, so we're going to prioritize. We're not going to lend to housing in the major cities, because we don't need to. All the private banks want to do that. We'll lend to housing out in the regional areas that the private banks are ignoring, because that's important. But we're going to have this enormous power of credit. Let's boost businesses. Let's boost manufacturing, and you can be incredibly flexible if you're a government bank, right? You can change the payback time, the amortisation period, right? You can have a marginally lower interest rate, right? You can be flexible in the way that you enforce the payments. So if it's a farm or something else that's seasonally affected or some event happens, unlike a private bank coming in and foreclosing, you can go, no, we'll be patient, right? Because you can be patient. And just that little bit of patience, that little bit of flexibility makes these loans viable, and suddenly these businesses have credit and they can do amazing things with it, right? They can bring their products to market, they can invest in that capital equipment that we're talking about, they can do all those things and increase their productivity and increase the nation's productivity. And then if you did that, the private banks would want to jump in on the action actually, right?
Well, yeah.
And you'll get them to do some of this as well.
Exactly, and then it wouldn't necessarily be all housing, and they wouldn't have to, just go into housing because other things become profitable. And I wanted to hone in on that now, because looking at that graph again, and you look at the green line where all that credit's just been shoved into housing, which has inflated the housing bubble.
Yep.
And sorry to do this to you viewers out there, because if you're a mortgage holder, one of our people came across this video. It was reported by news.com.au. And believe me, I feel your pain just watching this video clip. It's just drives you crazy, because this is a Four Corners video from August 1975. And you'll see, I won't go through all the details, but you'll see, just as a comparison, a family in Sydney with 6 kids, both of them working. I think in that case, there's another case where only one of the parents are working. But yeah, the home costs $6,000. Mortgage repayments are $31 a month. Now, adjusted for inflation, that $6,000 would be the equivalent of $96,500 at the present time. And the monthly repayment of $31 on the mortgage would be the equivalent of $269. That would be nice per month. And the guy's salary in this case, this Mount Druitt family, was $8,500 a year, equal to $73,900 today. And the figures cited by the news.com.au article using Finder data is that in 1984, the average home was 3.3 times income. Today, 15 times income to buy the average home of around $1 million. So it could be more than that, even in many cases in just basic, suburbs. So let's watch that video clip.
11 miles north of the centre of Sydney, the peach blossoms and magnolias are blooming. The people who live here have achieved the great Australian ideal. Their own home, brick and tile of course, lots of room for the kids to play, plenty of trees, perhaps a swimming pool in the back garden. "30 miles west of the centre of Sydney, the trees aren't so plentiful or so pretty. But the people who live here have also gone a long way toward achieving the great Australian dream. Here the houses are fibro and weatherboard rather than brick and tile, and here the swimming pools aren't so numerous or so fancy. Here in Pymble, you won't buy a block of land for less than $40,000. These are the homes of the wealthy and the successful. Company directors, doctors, architects and engineers. Their average income is $16,000 a year, and they've returned a Liberal member to Parliament for as long as anyone can remember. Here in Mount Druitt, the average price of a block of land is $10,000. These are the homes of your honest artisans, labourers, boilermakers, factory hands and motor mechanics. Their average income is $8,000 a year, and most of them vote Labor. What is the lifestyle of an average Pymble family? To find out, you could do worse than drive down Cynthia Street and stop at number 20. This is the home of the Tiltons family.
5.
Ted Tiltons is 38. He sells office equipment, and in June this year, he paid tax on an income of $16,500. Joan Tiltons is 34, and she's been married to Ted for 18 years. For her, looking after Ted and the kids is a full-time job. When Ted Tiltons bought this house 9 years ago, he paid $23,000. His monthly mortgage repayment is $200. When this house in Mount Druitt was bought 12 years ago, it cost just over $6,000, and the mortgage repayments are a mere $31 a month. It's the home of the Van der Voort family.
Calling you a cheeky then.
Kees Van der Voort is 45. He's a mechanic, and in June this year, he paid tax on an income of $8,500. Nellie Van der Voort is 40, and she's been married to Kees for 20 years. She supplements the family income with a full-time job as a factory hand. Joanne Van der Voort is 19 and about to become a nurse. Connie is 17 and works at a nearby news agency. Tony is 14, Adrian 13, Colin 10, and Christopher 8. They're all full-time school pupils, and in case you weren't counting, that's a family of 6 children.
Well, should have bought back then. No, who would have? I can tell you now, Elisa, nobody who lived in Australia from 1900 to 2000, where house prices were always little tiny fluctuations, but they were always 3 to 4 times household annual household income, right? Nobody could have foreseen what was going to happen after the year 2000, except the people who conspired to do it, and they should have. And maybe it was unintended consequences. But by 2004, they knew that they had introduced these policies that turned housing into a Ponzi scheme, and now that's completely unaffordable. And that brings us back to what I said at the top of the show. There is no solution to the housing crisis that's about getting more people into the market.
Yeah.
We have to make housing less expensive. And one way that governments can do that is build a lot more public housing. And it's a great break on the housing market. It's a it modulates the market always. We used to have, up until they privatised all this stuff in the 80s, we had a massive stock of public housing, and the people who couldn't afford housing could always afford housing. You go in there, right? And so that's the only thing governments can really do.
Well, apart from the other things we were just discussing, because in terms of all that infrastructure and capital investment, that increases productivity, which in turn increases wages, which balances as well what you're paying for a house.
But develop regional Australia, bring the industries back in those places, make people want to live in those towns rather than cramming into Melbourne and Sydney.
Exactly.
All those
Very
sorts of
important.
things.
Lots of solutions there, and we just got to.
If you have the public institutions that governments need, the tools, starting with the government bank.
Yep. All right, so join the Citizens Party, link below. That's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
And see you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.